Okay. Welcome to an Ask the Experimentation Expert session with myself, Aaron Montana, Experimentation Solution Specialist here at LaunchDarkly. And today we're going to talk about how to build a scalable experimentation framework. And as always, feel free to jump into the Q&A section if you have any questions. As we go, we'll definitely have some time, or we should have some time, to answer any specific questions you might have about this or anything experimentation related. We don't have hours and hours, but I will always try to squeeze in time for questions. Okay, what are we going to chat about today? The challenge of scaling experimentation, and a little bit about why it's important. 3 keys to scalable experimentation, and then hopefully some time for Q&A. Okay, so what are the challenges to scale experimentation? And before we even get super deep into that, it is worth noting, why do we scale experimentation? What is the cause and purpose for this, knowing that there's some effort involved? Well, scaling the experimentation practice at your organization is very important for achieving the value of experimentation. Ideally, we would run only winning tests. We would knock it out of the ballpark every single time we run an experiment on our website, application, server, or whatever it might be. But the reality is, none of us are quite that clever. And so instead, we run a lot of tests, some of which win, some of which just teach us things. And we get the value by scaling that program so that these marginal kind of small wins add up over time and bring real value to the organization. The more friction you can reduce on doing this, the easier you can make this for your developers to implement, the more value you'll see from this altogether. And so it's important to tackle this challenge of scaling experimentation overall so that we can really achieve that. So there are kind of 3 keys to faster and better experimentation programs. And the first of which is knowing when to experiment and when not to, what makes a good experiment. The second is choosing the right tool. Experimenting in LaunchDarkly is easy and somebody say fun, those people being me. And building decision points and enabling measurement is really important. It's something that a flexible tool like LaunchDarkly allows you to do. And it's also something that's in your developer's toolkit now. And then the third point here is turning results into confident action. How we interpret the results that LaunchDarkly will provide to you to make better decisions is a really important factor in actually scaling the program up. If you don't understand your results, or if you've created tests that are hard to understand and interpret, then you may have issues actually taking action on those things. So let's go a little bit deeper into each one of these. What makes a good experiment? There are many, many factors. Here are 4 that I think are really important, that really resonate with most organizations. Some organizations will have some very specific factors, but these kind of apply to everybody. First is high uncertainty, high impact, right? So you don't know if a change will help or hurt, and it could meaningfully affect customer experience or KPIs. This is the category of experiments where we are really certain that there will be a high impact because it's a highly visible change often, or it is a major change in something that has existed for a long time. And what we don't know is what will happen when we actually do it. One of the things that we often see in experimentation is whole sets of changes done together that cause a lot of impact. Whereas if we were to break things down into smaller pieces, we might have smaller impact overall. In both cases, you want to run an experiment. In the case of a really high impact kind of set of changes, you kind of have to run an experiment. I think there's a good discussion to be had here around the idea of testing into larger changes as opposed to making whole sets of changes all at once. And that's something we could totally talk about. Okay, what else makes a good experiment? Conflict. Conflicting opinions or assumptions are common, right? Stakeholders disagree on what's the right path. And sometimes there's no clear evidence for what the approach should be. Experimentation brings objective data to subjective decisions. A lot of the times we are mixing both qualitative and quantitative information in the outcomes of an experiment to learn a lot more about what's going on. And this ends up being super important for us. There's also something that we talk about in the experimentation industry called the hippo effect, and it's the highest paid person's opinion. This often leads to experiments. In the world where experimentation is not being done, these people use their influence to affect change, and the outcomes are questionable. The nice thing about experimentation is that it gives you a good framework to challenge those opinions and make sure that we're making the right decision based on the best data, as opposed to the most important person's opinion. Okay, the next thing here is random audience and exposure. And this one seems a little silly, but it is the basis for experimentation and actually what makes experimentation the best approach for measuring these kinds of outcomes. That is to say that without this aspect, right, without the ability to do random audience allocation, without the ability to measure things in parallel, what you're really doing is making comparisons to things that are not exactly comparable, right? So if you've probably, before, for folks who do not have an active experimentation practice or who remember back to the time when they were beginning, you'll probably remember sometimes when, instead of looking at experimentation data as you would now, instead you looked at historical data and compared it to changes that you've already made live, right? So we look at this as year over year, week over week type data, and instead of good scientific evidence, instead what we have is interpretation of what we believe the change has affected if we look at similar circumstances that happened in the past. It's not a terrible way to go about things, but it's not so scientific, and it's not going to give you the best outcome. So the feature or experience should be randomly assigned to users, and the more exposure you can get, the faster and more reliable the results. This is just a key aspect of any kind of experimentation program. Okay, and the last one here that is definitely super important and kind of should be part of your practice and part of the way you plan things anyway, is measurable outcomes. So right now, if you're not running an experimentation practice formally, then what you're doing is you're running experiments without measuring the outcomes. There are almost always measurable impacts to the changes that you make. But when you don't measure them, you really just don't know what you don't know. And when you don't measure them in an experimentation practice, you really don't have a basis for comparison. One of the things that you'll want to do as you ramp up an experimentation practice is learn to build in a validation step to your intake process. And this validation step will help you to identify what the measurable outcomes are. One of those will be embedded directly in the hypothesis of your experiment. I think that if I do this, this thing will occur. That's your obvious, primary metric. But there will be other measurable outcomes associated with almost any experiment that we'll want to look at and consider as well. So the key to this, you can clearly define what better looks like: conversion, engagement, latency, etc. And if you can't measure it, it's not testable. One of the things that I often say when it comes to kind of validating a problem and determining the measurable outcome is that if you can't measure what the outcome is, what you have is just feelings. And feelings are great, but they're not going to help us decide if an experiment has won. Okay, so what is not going to help you make a good experiment? The first one I think everybody should take very seriously when an improvement is obvious. So there are occasions when we get very deep into the process of experimentation and we're really feeling good about the practice, that we begin to want to just experiment on everything. And this is great. This is a fun time for us. But if we're being, practical, there are a ton of changes we make that are just clearly positive, things that we should just do. And we should find those in the intake process when we kind of do problem identification and when we think about what experiments we're going to be running and prioritizing. Some of these will creep in, and it's kind of mostly self-doubt in some cases. And those will be borderline, and some of these will just be obvious. So if the change is clearly positive or it's just correcting a bug, things are broken, we don't need extra data to tell us anything about that. Just go with the fixing something and making it a better experience, and you can rely on that. Now, if you begin to see some unexpected outcomes there, that'll be interesting, and you definitely could dig in with an experiment to help you understand that. But I wouldn't start there. I would lean on obvious improvements and just putting those right through your development queue. Okay. Also, low risk or low impact experimentation. This one's a little bit harder to know. So if you're making small UI changes or small tweaks to copy that won't move meaningful metrics, then you may not want to test on this. You're essentially adding a lot to your workload with probably not much outcome. Now, I will say this. Some of these things are not the same as others, right? So changes to the text in your navigation, for example, may have way more impact than changes to the text in your footer. And this is what we're talking about. If it's both low risk or low impact, then you may not need to run a test there. Now, that said, there are some situations where, for example, certain CTAs that appear above the fold have a lot of eyes on them on your landing pages, and the text to that may be quite impactful. We've also seen what we kind of joke about in the industry is things like button color tests, which seem a little bit silly, actually have huge changes. But those are really specific cases that have a lot to do with user engagement and user interaction. And so we need to understand a little bit about what our users do on our site and how they engage with our site to make this determination. But once you do, you will find that there are plenty of things that are just too low impact to really make much of a difference, or just have too little data, which actually we'll get to a little bit in a second. Okay, time-sensitive launches. So this is another interesting one. We can typically tell how long it's going to take to run a test, as long as we have some baseline around how much traffic is involved. So if you don't have the time to wait for results, then you're wasting a little bit of effort to actually run the experiment. This is, this happens occasionally. This is part of your planning and part of the process. And one of the things I like to remind folks about is that this is a practice, and we have to do it a lot. And the part of the practice itself involves many steps, not just the actual hands-on work of deploying the test. And so part of your practice should be understanding, is there a time impact relative to what we're trying to do that makes this test just not feasible or not really practical? Okay, the last one I sort of alluded to, and let's definitely make sure to take some time to talk about it. It's lack of data or metrics. If you can't track the success or don't have enough users to detect a difference, then testing won't be useful. So again, this falls into the validation phase. If we cannot determine an outcome, then we can't make a meaningful measurement. Now, I do want to pick this apart a little bit. There are some situations where we know what we need to measure to understand the outcome, but we are unable to measure it, which is to say that, for example, we're doing lead generation, and these leads that we generate on a website actually go to a real person out in the field somewhere, at a car dealership or an insurance agency or whatever it may be. And this person reaches out to contact people and that lead turns into something very real. The process of tracking that data may be really difficult. And if you can't track it right now, then you can't run the experiments around that. That doesn't mean you'll never be able to run those experiments. You should make an effort to try to aggregate that data in a way where it can be fed back into these systems that are very meaningful, these sources of truth, where they can be used for these kinds of experiments. And that will unlock a lot more of experimentation power for you. But when you can't do it, there's no use in really trying to form experiments around them. Put those on your to-do list, add them to your problem library, and make sure to unlock them as soon as you can. Okay, let's talk a little bit about experimenting in LaunchDarkly specifically. There are a lot of tools out there to do experimentation. Folks have written their own tools in the past. LaunchDarkly is really probably the best tool in the market for doing experimentation because it provides the best foundation for you, along with really practical tools for doing it. So here's a day in the life of a team that runs experiments. Your mileage may vary, but this is this reminds me a lot of when I ran a lot of experiments at agencies or internally with other organizations. You have this backlog of untested ideas, which I was referring to earlier as a problem library. You begin to implement a new feature. You design that experiment for that feature. You launch this and watch the results come in. You present this back to stakeholders. You roll out the best version of this. And you iterate on what you learned, and the whole process starts all over again. And so we are, in fact, kind of constantly running through this cycle at different points in the cycle simultaneously as we run different experiments and iterating on what we learn. LaunchDarkly sits with you in every step of this process. The engineers are using our tool hands-on to create the feature flags and do tracking around what you're going to learn. The product and data science team may be using our experimentation builder to come in and determine how we will divide traffic and get people to the place they need to go and what we need, what kind of attribution we need. These same folks will sit and look at the results. Even those of us who are trained to understand these results will still go and peek at them constantly. And then we take this data and we tell a story with it. We present it back to the users, the product team, the stakeholders to make decisions on it. And we do it again and again and again. To expedite this, LaunchDarkly offers a lot of features to help here, right? So we can help you measure the impact of every feature. We allow you to basically connect and verify key metrics aligned with the features and exactly who saw them in your code base. We allow you to flexibly integrate with your data workflows. So this cuts down on the time it takes to deliver winning experiences, and it also enhances visibility into experimentation. So these are, existing tools in your workflow that may be on the development side or on the release side or on the analysis and analytics side. And then we also allow you to experiment with statistical rigor. In other words, we're providing the experimentation approach and models that you need to truly understand the outcomes. You can get in and measure things and run just eyeball comparisons between things, but it's not going to be as powerful as if you run true statistical models in the background and have a really trustworthy set of results like the ones our data scientists here at LaunchDarkly have provided. The other thing that we're allowing you to do is really just experiment on everything. So everything your code touches, everywhere that LaunchDarkly's SDKs may exist, there is a possibility to run an experiment. Some of these will be feature experiments. Some of these will be funnel optimization, where we have a linear set of steps, and we'd really like to see the drop off between each of those. And newest to this platform, the AI config experiments. This allows you to test different models, different prompts, and different parameters against each other in real time as we roll out LLMs within our applications. This is very exciting and a really interesting part of the experimentation platform. So it allows us to take this, this special product that we've created for managing LLMs in your code base and do direct comparison beyond just regular monitoring, actual A/B testing against these LLMs and how they perform. And the outcomes can be really surprising, right? Sometimes we're looking to optimize for cost. Sometimes we're looking to optimize for outcomes, and sometimes a combination of the two. this is a really interesting aspect of experimentation that's emerging, and we're excited to be providing tools for that. Another thing is that we have to meet you where your analysis is happening, where your data flows actually are. And this is why we offer 3 different paths for this. We have our standard experimentation, and this means essentially that our SDKs are responsible for sending the data, and LaunchDarkly itself is responsible for doing all the analysis. It's kind of end-to-end, and all you need are SDKs to do this anywhere in your application. We also have the warehouse experimentation pathways, which give you 2 other options. One is you bring your own analysis. This is for organizations that already have notebooks and BI tools set up to do all kinds of analysis of your own and perhaps run your own models and things like that. And this is great, but you still need the mechanisms that LaunchDarkly provides for doing traffic assignment and risk mitigation around the releases themselves, and doing it in real time with the trusted flag delivery network that LaunchDarkly provides as a foundation. This is perfect for those teams. You have your own tools in place, and what we're doing is providing the backbone for them. And then there's a third one here where LaunchDarkly also provides additional analysis. And this is really great for the teams that have put in the effort to pull all of their measurements, all of their eventing from various applications into one place. So if you're using Snowflake's warehouse, for example, as the final destination for most of the events that are triggered across your ecosystem of applications, this will allow us to run our models against those, and kind of a best of both worlds. You get all of your data in one place, and you get your analysis done by LaunchDarkly. All right, here we go. Turning results into confident action. This is a really key part of the experimentation practice that cannot be ignored, which is to say that you need to be able to pick the right approach and also tell the right story around what you're learning in order for folks to appreciate and take action and feel comfortable with what you're doing. For this reason, we have flexible statistics to allow you to choose the correct model for what you're doing. And in some cases, this will be based on just the necessities of what you're doing. So maybe we will never get enough traffic to reasonably run a frequentist style experiment, and so we'll choose Bayesian in those cases. And this may also have more to do with the organizational's preference and just want for a particular model. We offer both. These are the 2 most accepted models in the industry, and without a doubt, the most widely used. The other aspect here is just creating really good usable dashboards for folks. With experimentation, unlike with what you've probably seen with product analytics, if you've been in that space for a while, experimentation dashboards tend to be the same from experiment to experiment, which is exactly what you want, because models and dashboards for experimentation need to be directly comparable against each other. And we really don't want to deviate in what we produce and show in those instances. Unlike in a traditional analytics product, where you might put together particular points of interest and particular kinds of diagrams for tracking what you're interested in learning about as a customer journey or impact of any change. So this gives us a really good view of exactly what how an experiment is performing, and we use the same model each time, and allows us to make these decisions really quickly. Another thing I definitely want to talk about before we wrap this up is the idea of slicing data. Slicing data is very important because one of the things that we know is we want to run experiments typically on the widest group of users possible. But we also know that within that group of users, within our sample, there are some subgroups, and each of those subgroups could perform differently. The most common of these would be mobile versus desktop. Quite simply, people just use their phones differently than they use desktop computers. And I've seen this many times where changes have completely different effects on the mobile versus desktop, even though fundamentally it is the same change. And so slicing data, at least in a one-dimensional fashion, is very important, something that we offer based on the attributes that you pass in through a LaunchDarkly context. Okay, we've ended this presentation, and it's time for some Q&A if folks would like to. I haven't seen any questions come in. I'll double check the chat as well, but we do have a couple minutes for Q&A if people like. Otherwise, I'm happy to just pontificate on experimentation. I'd also like to take a quick moment and encourage people to register for Galaxy 2025. This is an online event, and it's going to be really interesting this year. We have a ton of fascinating product offerings and updates about about LaunchDarkly that I think you're going to want to hear. A lot of great walkthroughs and deep dives into all the fun things we've been doing this year and for the rest of the year that I think will be really exciting for folks. So please take a moment to register and join us virtually for Galaxy 2025. It's happening in May. Okay, all right, we don't have any questions in, but I did want to go back. I'm going to circle back on one point that we talked a little bit about, and I think we could spend more time on, and that is slicing. So slicing data is a really interesting thing that I think we kind of don't talk about enough, which is to say that anytime you have a context, and a context is in LaunchDarkly commonly a user, but often something else, like maybe a store or a kiosk or a request at the level of like a network request. When we randomize those things, the attributes that surround them are really interesting for breaking things down. So I mentioned mobile versus desktop. This is the most common, and it's kind of easy to understand. But when you begin to broaden your thoughts about what this might be, what we're really thinking about is any data that is categorical, right? So when we begin to break down things by tier or age of account or location, these things allow us to group users together in unique and interesting ways. And when we do that, the upside of this is that we can also then go deeper on how we target experiences for subgroups of users. So in the example I was giving before about desktop versus mobile, probably the most interesting thing about that example is that if you learn that the experience affected mobile and desktop users differently, we're free to make targeting rules specific to those platforms. So what it really means is that we can capture the capture the most margin, capture the most valuable experience for each of those groups, because all that information is already available to us. And the mechanism for doing that targeting and giving that experience to those different groups is already there. So when we learn something about that, we can go back in and do targeting rules to create what some would call baseline personalization in real time. We don't need to do additional deployments. We don't need to do anything else. All of those pieces are in place. We just needed to learn which groups prefer what. And both of those options are available to us. Okay, we're right at time. I think we'll go ahead and sign off. And thank you for sticking around and chatting with me today.